Hello, and welcome to week 11 of high school mythology. So, this week we go through a pretty rapid overview of brief myths. However, if there are a couple that you would like to discuss more, please feel free to put that in the reply section on our classroom page, and I'll be happy to have a discussion with you there and maybe give you some more information if there's one of these myths that really, captured your interest. So I'll go ahead now and pull up the slides so we can have a visual for each of the myths that we go over. So we talked last week about Pomona and Vertumnus and how that story conveys a Roman ideal, particularly about marriage, and how it has that connection to Halloween too, because of the apple orchard and the way that we have apples that we like to bob for apples, which, is kind of gross when you think about it. But also like caramel apples and candy apples. So this week, as I said, we kind of fly through some of these other myths. So we'll just go ahead and talk about Amalthea. Amalthea is a goat on whose milk Zeus was fed. If you'll recall, we talked about how Zeus's mother sent him away when he was born so that his father could not swallow him, right? Send him away so that he could be nurtured elsewhere and he could come back and overthrow his father once he had grown to be strong enough. So Amalthea in some stories is said to have had a horn which was always full of whatever food or drink anyone wanted. This horn is known horn is known this horn is known as a cornucopia, or a horn of plenty, which you've probably seen around harvest time, fall, Thanksgiving. You see that horn of plenty or cornucopia. However, there are some other myths that say that this cornucopia came instead from Aeschylus, whenever Hercules broke off the horn when he conquered the river god Aeschylus. So you have some variations there as far as where this cornucopia originated. Then we have the Amazons. Aeschylus calls them the warring Amazons, men haters. They were a nation of women, all of them warriors. They were supposed to live around the Caucasus region. We talked about the Caucasus eagle when we studied Prometheus. And so their chief city for the Amazons was Themyscira. They inspired artists to make statues and pictures of them, but you don't see as many writings about the Amazons. Most of what we see of them is depicted instead in art. However, in the Trojan War, they are mentioned. They fought the Greeks under their queen, according to a story told by Pausanias, which is not in the Iliad, which of course is Homer. So some other, aspects of the Amazons can be seen in writing too. Then we have Amymone, and Amymone was one of the dyads. Remember we talked, or Danaids rather. Remember we talked about the Danaids whose father did not want them to marry their cousin, so he gave them the dagger on their wedding nights and had them use those to kill their husbands. So Amymone was one of them. Her father sent her to draw water, and a satyr saw her and began to pursue her. Poseidon heard her cry for help. He loved her greatly, and he saved her from the satyr. With his trident, he made in her honor the spring which bears her name, Amymone. Then we have Antiope. Antiope was a princess of Thebes. She had two sons by Zeus, Zethus and Amphion. She was afraid of her father's great anger because she had these children. So she left them on a mountain as soon as they were born, which we've seen this kind of a story before. Think about Oedipus and the way he was left. But just like Oedipus was discovered, so too were Antiope's sons. They were discovered by a herdsman and they were brought up by him. The man that was ruling Thebes at the time, Lycus, and his wife Dirce, treated Antiope with great cruelty until she determined that she was going to hide away from them. She finally came to the cottage where her sons lived, and somehow, as only we see in mythology, right? They recognized each other. And so they gathered up a band of their friends to go to the palace and avenge Antiope's poor treatment. So they killed the king Lycus and brought a terrible death upon Dirce. They tied her by her hair to a bull. Then the brothers threw her body into the spring, which was ever after called by her name. Then we have the story of Arachne. So Arachne, as you can probably recognize, is connected to our word arachnid, right? Meaning spider, and arachnophobia, right? The fear of spiders. So Arachne's story is told by the Latin poet Ovid. So in the story of Arachne, she is a masterful weaver, and she claims that she can weave just as well as Minerva. And Minerva, of course, is the Roman name for the Greek goddess Athena. So Arachne makes this claim, which we've talked about numerous times. Hubris is one of the worst things that you can exhibit. And if you do, you're going to get avenged by the gods. So Arachne weaves in a contest with Minerva this beautiful tapestry. And according to our text, it states that Arachne's weaving was no less beautiful than Minerva's. So her bragging actually had some basis to it. But Minerva is so angry with her that she just rips apart the work that she did and beats her up. And because of this, Arachne is so overwhelmed with grief that she takes her own life. However, Minerva begins to feel guilty because of the way that she treated Arachne. She feels bad for all of that. And so she makes it up to Arachne by bringing her back to life as a spider. Thus, if she's a spider, of course, she can eternally weave her lovely webs, right? So that's again where we get this arachnid word. Then we have the story of Arion. And Arion seems to have been an actual person, a poet who lived around 700 BC, but none of his poems have actually come down to us. All that we know of him is how he escaped from death. So he had gone from Corinth to Sicily to take part in this music contest. And he was a master of the lyre and he won the prize. But on the voyage home, the sailors coveted his prize and they planned to kill him. Apollo told him in a dream that he was in danger. Apollo, of course, being the god of the lyre too, the god of music. And so he told him he was in danger, and then he told him how he could save his life. So when the sailors attacked Arion, he begged them as a last favor to let him play one more song before he died. At the end of the song, he flung himself into the sea, and there were dolphins who had been drawn to the ship by this beautiful, enchanting music that he played. They bore him up right as he began to sink, and they carried him to land. Then we have the story of Orestes. He was a beekeeper. He was the son of Apollo by a water nymph, Cyrene. His bees all died from some unknown cause. So he went to his mother the sea nymph or the water nymph for help. She told him that Proteus, the wise old god of the sea, that we've mentioned him before, he shapeshifts. But she told her son that Proteus could help, that he could show him how to prevent this from happening again. And so he would only do it, of course, if he was compelled to give away his secret. So Proteus had the power, as we mentioned, to change himself into various forms. So if his captor was, determined enough, he could hold on to him through all of the changes he made. And then Proteus would finally give in and answer the question or give the advice to help. So Eurystheus followed these directions. He went to the favorite spot of Proteus. He grabbed him up. He refused to let him go. And the god finally, gave in and returned to his own shape. And he told Aristeus to sacrifice to the gods and then to leave the carcasses of the animals in the place of sacrifice. So he did this, and then he was told 9 days later he had to go back and examine the bodies. And Aristeus did this too. And on the 9th day, he was amazed to find a great swarm of bees in one of the carcasses. So he was never, troubled again with any, deaths or illnesses of his bees. And this story is referenced or alluded to in the Iliad. Homer writes, "Now from the couch where she lay beside high-born Tithonus, the goddess, Dawn, rosy-fingered, arose to bring light to the gods and mortals." So this Tithonus is the husband of Aurora, who is the goddess of dawn. And the father of her son is Prince Memnon of Ethiopia, who was killed at Troy, fighting for the Trojans. Tithonus himself had a very strange fate. Aurora and Zeus wanted to make him immortal, and he agreed, but Aurora had not thought to ask that he remain youthful, right? Because to be immortal doesn't mean that you're going to remain youthful. So he began to grow older and older and older, but he could not die. So he was helpless to escape this fate. So finally he prayed for death, but there was no release for him. His prayer was not answered. He had to live forever with old age, forever and ever pressing down on him. At last, in pity, the goddess laid him in the room and left him and shut the door, where he just babbled. Unfortunately, his mind was lost, his strength of his body was gone, and he just wasted away like that. There's also another story that states that he shrank and he shrank until Aurora, finally feeling a natural fitness of things and wanting to give him some sort of closure or help, she turned him into a skinny and noisy grasshopper. So to Memnon, who was his son, a great statue was erected in Egypt at Thebes, and it was said that the first rays of dawn fell upon it, and then a sound came from it like the twanging of a harp string. Then we have the story of Beton and Cleobus. They were sons of Cydippe, who was a priestess of Hera. She longed to see a most beautiful statue of the goddess of Argos, which was made by a great sculptor. Argos was too far away for her to be able to walk there, and she had no horses, no oxen, nothing that could take her to this lovely statue or sculpture. But her two sons determined that she should have her wish. They yoked themselves to a car, and they drew her all the way through dust, through heat. They really wanted to, get their mother to this lovely statue that she wanted to see. Everyone admired them for doing this for their mother. And finally, when they arrived at the statue, um, she began to pray and ask that Hera would reward her sons by giving them the best gift in her power. As she finished, the two lads sank to the ground. They were smiling. They looked as if they were peacefully asleep, but they had actually died. So, given the greatest power, they were just overwhelmed and just died. Then we have the story of Callisto, who was the daughter of Lycaon, a king of Arcadia. He had been changed into a wolf because he was very, very wicked. We see him do something that we've seen in some of these other myths. He set human flesh on the table for Zeus whenever the god came to have dinner. His punishment was deserved, but his daughter suffered as a result of it, even though she was innocent. That's something else we've seen before, too, when we talk about the punishments that get handed down from the parents to the children, where the children are having to pay for the sins of the parents. So this happens again in this story, too. Zeus saw the daughter hunting in the train of Artemis and fell in love with her. Hera, who was furiously angry, of course, turned the lovely girl into a bear after her son was born. So when the boy was grown and he was out hunting, the goddess brought Callisto before him, intending that he would shoot his own mother, in ignorance, of course. But Zeus instead snatched the bear away and placed her among the stars, where she is called the Great Bear. So again, we're getting an explanation here of something in the natural world, right? An explanation for a constellation. Later on, also, her son Arcas was placed beside her and called the Lesser Bear. And Hera, who was enraged at the honor bestowed on this woman and her son, she persuaded the god of the sea to forbid the bears from ever being able to descend into the ocean like the other stars. They alone of the constellations never sat below the horizon. So we have again an explanation there too of why the constellations are there and then why they're in the particular spots that they are. And then we have the story of Chiron, who was one of the centaurs, but he was not violent like the others were. He was known instead for his goodness and his wisdom. Heroes would get their sons to train with him. He trained Hercules. Indirectly and unintentionally, Hercules caused Chiron to die. So that is one of the unfortunate incidences that we see where Hercules didn't know his own strength. So then we have the story of Cleite. Her story is unique because instead of a god in love with an unwilling maiden, instead in this story, we have a maiden who falls in love with an unwilling god. Cleite was in love with the sun god, and he found nothing appealing about her at all. So she pined away on the ground outside where she could just watch him all the time, which then turned her face. She would follow the sun. And because she was constantly gazing and turning toward the sun, she was changed into a sunflower. So again, an explanation of a flower that we see. Then we have the story of Dryope. It shows once again how strongly the ancient Greeks disapproved of destroying or injuring trees. You have sacred trees, of course, that we've talked about. So Dryope and her sister Iole went out one day into a pool, planning to make garlands of flowers for the nymphs. She was carrying her son, and she saw near the water this beautiful lotus tree that was full of bright blossoms. So she plucked some of them to give to her baby. She was horrified when she saw drops of blood beginning to flow from the stem, because the tree was not just a tree, it was a nymph, Lotus, who had been fleeing from a pursuer and taken refuge in the form of a tree. So Dryope was completely horrified at the sight, and she tried to hurry away, running away from what she had done, but her feet would not move. They seemed to be rooted in place into the ground. Iole was watching her sister helplessly, and as she did, she began to see bark start to grow upward, covering the body of her sister Dryope. It had reached her face by the time her husband came to the spot with her father. Iole cried out to tell her father and her sister's husband what had happened to her. And the two men rushed to the tree, embraced it, and held it until she completely became transformed into a tree and was no longer herself. And the thing of this story too is she did not know, right? She did not intentionally go and pull the flowers off a nymph. She thought it was just a regular tree. But nevertheless, she was still doomed to be this tree forever. Then we have the story of Epimenides. Epimenides is important in mythology because of his story of long sleep. He lived around 600 BC, and it is said that as a boy, he went looking for a lost sheep. And then he was overcome by a slumber that lasted for 57 years. When he woke up, he continued to search for the sheep, unaware of what had happened, unaware that he'd been asleep for 57 years. So he was sent then by the oracle at Delphi to purify Athens of a plague. When the very grateful Athenians wanted to give him a large sum of money, he refused, and he asked only that there should be friendship between Athens and his own home, Knossos, in Crete. So you may be familiar with the story too of Rip Van Winkle, which is Washington Irving's story of a man who falls asleep in the Catskill Mountains, and he sleeps for 20 years. When he falls asleep, the area he's in is still under the control of the British. However, when he wakes up, the American Revolution has taken place, and now the British no longer have control. So he wakes up and finds a multitude of changes have taken place. So possibly Washington Irving drew a little bit from this myth of Epimenides when he was writing about Rip Van Winkle. Then we have the story of Eryctheneus. He is sometimes called Erechtheus. Homer knew him by that name. However, Plato speaks of two, both Erycthenes and Eryxias. And he was the son of Hephaestus, and he was raised or reared by Athena. He was a half man, half serpent. Athena gave a chest in which she put the infant to the three daughters of Cecrops and forbade them to open it. However, of course, they opened it anyway, and they saw the serpent-like creature. Because of this, Athena drove them mad to punish them, and they ended up taking their own lives by jumping from the Acropolis. But when the infant Eryctheneus grew up, he became king of Athens. His grandson was called by his name, and was the father of the second sea crops, Procris, Creusa, and Erythia, whose stories we talked about a few sections ago. And then we have the story of Hero and Leander. Leander was a youth of Abydos. Hero was a priestess of Aphrodite in Cestus. So every night, Leander would swim across to her, guided by light. Some say that the light came from the lighthouse in Cestus. Some say that a torch Hero always set blazing on top of it, top of a tower, is what lit the way. But there was one very stormy night in which the light was blown out by the wind, and Leander died. His body was then washed up on the shore, and Hero, finding it, took her own life. Then we have the Hyades. They were daughters of Atlas. Recall Atlas, the one who has the whole the world on his back, right? And they were half sisters of the Pleiades. They were known as the rainy stars. They were supposed to bring rain because the time of their evening and their morning setting comes in early May and November, and that's usually a rainy season. So there were 6 of them. Dionysus, as a baby, was given to them by Zeus to reward them for their care. He set them among the stars. We recall, of course, Dionysus, that Zeus rescued him from the thigh of Semele so that he could end up being able to carry his son, right? And Dionysus is, of course, the god of wine and revelry and god of the vine. Then we have the story of Ibycus and the cranes. So Ibycus is actually a poet who lived around 550 BC. There are only a few fragments of his poems that have actually come down to us. All that is known of him is the very dramatic story of his death. He was attacked by robbers near Corinth, and they fatally wounded him. At the time, a flock of cranes flew by overhead, and he called on them to avenge him. Soon after, over an open theater in Corinth where a play was being performed, the flock of cranes appeared. They hovered above the crowd. Suddenly, a man's voice was heard to call out, panicked, right? The cranes of Ibycus, the cranes of Ibycus, the avengers. The audience in turn shouted, the murderer has informed against himself. So the man was seized, and the other robbers were discovered, and they were all put to death. Then we have the story of Leto. Leto is the daughter of the Titans Phoebe and Caius. Zeus loved her, but when she was about to bear his children, he abandoned her because he was afraid of Hera. All countries, all islands were also so afraid of Hera that they refused to receive Leto, and they refused to give her a place where she would be able to have her children. So she wandered and she wandered and she wandered desperately until she finally reached this small piece of land which was floating on the sea. It had no foundation, but instead it was tossed back and forth by the waves and the winds. It was called Delos. And besides being the most insecure of all islands, it was also the most rocky and barren. But as soon as Leto set foot on it and asked for refuge, the little island welcomed her. And at that moment, 4 lofty pillars rose from the bottom of the sea and then held it firmly in place, anchoring it forever. There, Leto's children were born, Artemis and Apollo, and they were visited by men from all over the world. The barren rock was called the Heaven-Built Isle, and it went from being the most despised place to becoming the most renowned of all the islands. Then we have the story of Linus. In the Iliad, there's a vineyard that's described with youths and maidens singing, gathering fruits. This was probably a lament or a song of sadness for the young son of Apollo and Semele, Linus, who was deserted by his mother, then brought up by shepherds, and before he was fully grown, he was torn to pieces by dogs. Linus was a type of all lovely young that dies or withers before it has actually borne fruit. The Greek word alanon means woe for Linus, and it grew to mean what we use in English as alas, right? Anything we lament, right? Alas. So there was also another Linus too that was the son of Apollo and a muse, and he taught Orpheus and tried to teach Hercules, but instead was killed by Hercules. Yet again, a time in which Hercules does not realize his own strength. Then we have the story of Marpessa. So Marpessa was more fortunate than other maidens that were beloved of the gods. Idas, one of the heroes of the Caledonian hunt, and also one of the Argonauts, carried her off from her father with her consent. So she actually wanted to go. They would have lived happily ever after, but Apollo fell in love with Marpessa. But Ida refused to give her up. He even dared to fight Apollo for her. Zeus parted them and told Marpessa to choose which she would have. She chose the mortal, fearing that the god would not be faithful to her. So that's a rare case too, where she actually gets a choice, right, as to who she wants to be with. Then we have the story of Marsyas. The flute was invented by Athena, but she threw it away because in order to play it, she had to puff out her cheeks, and that made her face look unattractive. And so she, therefore, was not interested in playing the flute. Marsyas, was a satyr. He found the flute and he played it so enchantingly that he dared to actually challenge Apollo to a contest. Of course, Apollo won, and he punished Marsyas by flaying him. So again, the very dangerous consequences of hubris. Then we have the story of Melampus. He actually saved and reared two small snakes when his servants killed the parent snakes. And as pets, they repaid him well. One time he was asleep and they crept up on his couch and licked his ears. He started up, right, in great fright, as one would do. But he found out that he understood what two birds on his windowsill were saying to each other. The snakes had made him able to understand the language of all flying and all creeping creatures. He learned in this way the art of divination, right? Prophecy, being able to speak of what's coming in the future. And he had it in a greater way than anyone ever had. So he became a famous soothsayer. He saved himself too by his knowledge. His enemies at one time captured him and kept him prisoner in a small cell. While he was there, he heard the worms saying that the roof beams had been almost gnawed through, so it would soon fall and crush everyone beneath. At once, he told this to his captors and he asked to be moved elsewhere. They did so, and then right afterward, the roof fell in. Then his captors saw how great a diviner he was, and they set him free and also rewarded him. And then we have the story of Merope. Her husband was Cresphontes, who was a son of Hercules and the king of Messenia. He was killed in a rebellion with two of his sons. The man who succeeded him or became king after him Polyphontes took Merope as his wife, but her third son, Epitus, had been hidden by her in Arcadia. He returned many years later, pretending to be a man who had slain Epitus, and was kindly received by Polyphontes for this reason. His mother, however, not knowing who he was, planned to kill her son's murderer, as she thought him to be. However, in the end, she found out who he was, and the two together brought about Polyphontes' death. After this, Epitus became king. Then we have the story of the Myrmidons. They were men created from ants on the island of Aegina during the time in which Aeacus, Achilles' grandfather, was ruling. They were also Achilles' followers in the Trojan War. They were thrifty, industrious, and very brave. They were changed into men from ants because one of Hera, again with Hera, one attack of jealousy that she enacted. She was angry because Zeus loved Aegina, the maiden for whom the island Aegina is named, and whose son Aeacus became its king. So Hera sent forth this terrible pestilence which destroyed the people by the thousands, and it seemed that no one would be left alive at all. Aeacus then climbed to the high temple of Zeus and prayed to him, reminding him that he was his son and the son of the woman that Zeus had loved. As he spoke, he saw a troop of busy ants, and he called out to Zeus, "O Father, make of those creatures a people for me, as numerous as they, and fill my empty city." At this point, a peal of thunder answered him, and that night he dreamed that he saw the ants being transformed into humans. At daybreak, his son Telamon woke him up and said that there was a great host of men that were approaching the palace. So he went out and he saw this huge multitude, right? As many as the ants in number of men. They were all crying out that they were his faithful subjects. So in this way, Aegina was repopulated from an ant hill, and its people were called Myrmidons after the ant Myrmex, from which they had sprung. Then we have the story of Nisus and Scylla. So Nisus was king of Megara, and on his head he had a purple lock of hair, which he had been warned never to cut. The safety of his throne depended upon his preserving that purple lock of hair. So Minos of Crete laid siege to his city, but Nisus knew that no harm could come to him at all as long as he had the purple lock. His daughter Scylla used to watch Minos from the city wall, and she had fallen madly in love with him. So she could not think of any way to make Minos care for her except by taking her father's lock of hair to him and enabling him to then conquer the town. So in this case, we have another story of a daughter falling in love with her father, the king's enemy, and then bringing about destruction on her kingdom. So this is what she did. She cut the lock and she took it to Minos and confessed to Minos what she'd done. But instead of her getting what she expected, instead, Minos shrank from her in horror and drove her out of his sight. When the city had been conquered and the Cretans launched their ships to sail home, she came rushing to the shore, mad with passion, and she leapt into the water and grabbed the rudder of the boat which carried Minos. But at this moment, a great eagle swooped down on her. And the great eagle that swooped down on her was actually her father, whom the gods had saved by changing into a bird. So terrified, she let go of the rudder and she would have fallen into the water, but suddenly she too became a bird. Some god had pity on her, even though she was a traitor, and because she had sinned, because she loved someone, that kind of enabled that pitiful feeling towards her, and she was turned into a bird too. Then we have the story of Orion, which you've heard, I'm sure, of when you're speaking of constellations, right? Orion was a young man of huge stature and great beauty. He was a mighty hunter. He fell in love with a daughter of the king of Chios, and for her love, he declared that he would clear the island of wild beasts. So he brought the spoils of his chase always home to his beloved, whose name is sometimes said to be Arrow and sometimes Merope. Her father, Enipion, agreed to give her to Orion, but he kept putting off the marriage. One day, when Orion was drunk, he insulted the maiden, and Enipion appealed to Dionysus to then punish Orion. So the god threw Orion into a deep sleep, and Enipion blinded him. An oracle told him, however, that he would be able to see again if he went to the east and let the rays of the rising sun fall on his eyes. He went as far east as Lemnos, and there he recovered his sight. Instantly, he started back to Chios to take vengeance on the king, but he had fled, and so Orion could not find him. So then he went on to Crete, and he lived there as Artemis's huntsman. Nevertheless, in the end, the goddess killed him. Some say that Dawn, also called Aurora, loved him, and that Artemis, in jealous anger, shot Orion. Others say that Orion made Apollo angry, and that the god, by a trick, got his sister to slay him. After his death, though, he was placed in heaven as a constellation, which shows him with a girdle, a sword, a club, and a lion's skin. Then we have the story of the Pleiades. They, as we've mentioned before, were the daughters of Atlas. There were 7 of them. Their names were Electra, Maya, Tagate, Alcyone, Merope, Calano, and Sterope. Orion pursued them, but they fled before him, and he could never grab any of them. But he still continued to follow them until Zeus, pitying them, placed them in the heavens as stars. But it was said that even there, Orion continued to pursue them, even though he was unsuccessful, and he just was persistent, regardless. They lived on Earth, or at the time they lived on Earth, one of them, Maya, was the mother of Hermes. Another, Electra, was the mother of Dardanus, who founded the Trojan race. Although it is agreed that there were 7 of them, there are only 6 stars that are visible in the Pleiades. The 7th is invisible, except to those who have specially keen sight. Then we have the story of Rhoecus. Rhoecus, seeing an oak about to fall, propped it up. The dryad, who would have perished with it, told him to ask anything that he desired, and she would give it to him as a reward for saving her. So he answered that all he wanted was her love, and so she consented. She bade him to keep on the alert, though, for she would send him a messenger, a bee, to tell him her wishes. But Rhoecus met some companions, and he forgot all about the bee, so much so that when he heard one buzzing, he drove it away and hurt it. Returning to the tree, he was then blinded by the dryad, who was so angry because he disregarded her words and injured her messenger bee. Then we have the story of Salmoneus, another illustration of how fatal it was for mortals to try to set themselves up as equal to or greater than the gods. Salmoneus did something that was so foolish that in later years, it was often said that he had absolutely gone mad. He pretended that he was Zeus. He had a chariot made in such a way that there was a loud clanging of brass when it moved. On the day of Zeus's festival, he drove it furiously through the streets, scattering firebrands and shouting at people to worship him. And he continuously claimed that he was Zeus, the thunderer. However, instantly there came a crash of actual thunder and a flash of lightning. At this point, Salmoneus fell from his chariot dead. The story is often explained as pointing back to a time when weather magic was practiced. And Salmoneus, according to this view, was a magician trying to bring on a rainstorm by imitating it, which was a common magical method. Then we have the story of Sisyphus. Sisyphus was king of Corinth. One day he saw a mighty eagle bearing a maiden to an island near the area where he was. So next thing, you have a river god, Asopus, who comes to him and says, my daughter Aegina has been carried off. And he strongly suspected Zeus did it. And so he asked Sisyphus for help. And then Sisyphus told him what he'd seen, that he'd seen this great eagle carrying off this maiden. And because Sisyphus told on Zeus, he drew down the wrath of Zeus upon him. In Hades, Sisyphus is the one that we've mentioned before, who's constantly punished by having to try forever to roll a stone up to the top of the mountain. And every time he gets the stone up to the mountain, it then rolls down and he has to do it again and again and again. Then we have the story of Tyro, who was daughter of Salmoneus. She bore twin sons to Poseidon, but she was afraid of her father's displeasure if he learned of the children's birth. So, in fashion as we've seen before, she abandoned them. They were found by the keeper, though, of Salmoneus's horses, who brought them up, and his wife, who called one Peleus and the other Neleus. Tyro's husband Cretheus discovered many years later what her relations with Poseidon had been. In great anger, he put her away and he married one of her maids, Cytero, and Cytero treated Tyro very badly. When Cretheus died, the twins were told by their foster mother who their real parents were. They went at once to seek out Tyro and discover themselves or show themselves to her. They found her living in great misery, and they looked for Cytero to be able to punish her. She'd heard of their arrival and she'd taken refuge in Hera's temple. However, Peleus still managed to find her and kill her, defying the anger of the goddess. Hera then revenged herself, but it took her many, many years. Peleus' half brother, the son of Tyro and Cretheus, was the father of Jason, whom Peleus tried to kill by sending him after the golden fleece. Remember the story of the golden fleece? That's Jason, right? But instead, Jason was indirectly the cause of his death. He was killed by his daughters under the direction of Medea, Jason's wife. So we see that connection here too. That covers these brief myths. Like I said, I know it's kind of a rapid fire way of going through these. So if you would like to discuss any of them in greater detail, just be sure to put that on the classroom page. Otherwise, I look forward to reading your responses, and I will be eager to interact with you. Bye.